of the European Congress of Qualitative Inquiry 2026 entitled Global Flows, Relational Connections, and Collaborative Practices in Challenging Times. The Congress will be opened with an address by the Vice Rector for Academic Affairs, International Relations and Extroversion, Professor Sofia Papaioannou.
Dear former Vice Rector of Academic Affairs and Student Matters, dear Dean of the School of Philosophy, dear Chair of the Faculty of Psychology of our university, dear colleagues, distinguished guests, dear students, it is with delight that I address you today at the opening ceremony of the 9th Interdisciplinary European Conference on Qualitative Inquiry. And I thank the organizing committee for inviting me to address this Congress. The topic of this year's conference is quite timely, set as it is at a moment when the notions of global flows, relational connections, and collaborative practices are being tested, redefined, and in many cases, profoundly strained. The distinguished speaker set to deliver the opening address next is a leading expert in the field and will introduce in detail the mounting challenges confronting us. We live in challenging times indeed, times marked by geopolitical fragmentation, environmental crisis, technological acceleration, and deep social inequality. Yet, these challenges do not merely obstruct collaboration. They force us to rethink its forms, its ethics, and its purposes. They compel us to ask not only how we collaborate, but why, with whom, and under what circumstances. Global flows of people, knowledge, capital, images, and data have long been described as the defining feature of modernity and late modernity alike. However, recent years have exposed their fragility. Borders harden, supply chains fracture, and informational flows become increasingly uneven and politicized. At the same time, new forms of circulation emerge. Digital networks that connect distant researchers instantaneously, grassroots movements that leap across national boundaries, and transdisciplinarity of knowledge that refuses to remain confined within institutional silos. These developments remind us that global flows are never neutral. They are structured by power, access, language, and infrastructure. Collaborative research must therefore remain critically attentive to asymmetries between North and South, center and periphery, established institutions, and precarious scholars. True collaboration is not the frictionless movement of ideas, but the difficult work of negotiating difference, vulnerability, and responsibility. This brings me to relational connections. Collaboration is not merely a technical agreement. It is a relational practice. It's built on trust, sustained by dialogue, and deepened through shared risk. In challenging times, relationality becomes both more fragile and more essential. When institutional frameworks falter or funding landscapes become uncertain, it is often personal and intellectual relationships that sustain research communities. We know that very well. Relational connections also require us to rethink the scale at which we work. Collaboration today moves constantly between the local and the global. Local knowledge, rooted in specific histories, languages, and environments, must be placed in dialogue with global perspectives, without being subsumed by them. This dialogue movement resists homogenization and instead values plurality as a condition of knowledge production. The present challenges, climate change, migration, public health crisis, technological governance, are not problems that any single discipline, nation, or methodology can address alone. They demand collaborative epistemologies, forms of knowledge that are interdisciplinary, participatory, and open to non-academic others. Artists, policymakers, local communities, and civil society organizations are not merely stakeholders, but co-producers of knowledge. Digital technologies have undeniably expanded the possibilities for collaboration, especially across distance. Yet they also risk producing new exclusions. Access to digital infrastructure, linguistic dominance, and algorithmic visibility shape who is heard and who remains invisible. Collaborative practices must therefore remain attentive to the material conditions that enable or constrain participation. Let us therefore imagine collaboration as a form of resistance. Resistance to intellectual enclosure, to epistemic injustice, and to the narrowing of our collective horizons. Let us cultivate global flows that are reciprocal rather than extractive, relational connections that are sustained rather than instrumental, and collaborative practices that are inclusive, reflective, and transformative. In doing so, we affirm a vision of research that is not only innovative, but humane, not only global, but grounded, not only responsive to crisis, but capable of shaping more just and resilient futures. A vision that this conference, I believe, is addressing to its core. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful conference.
Address by the Dean of the School of Philosophy of the National Kapodistrian University of Athens, Professor Dimitrios Drousos.
Dear Vice Rector of the University of Athens, dear ex-Vice Rector of our university, dear Director of the Faculty of Psychology, dear guests, distinguished colleagues. It's my great privilege to welcome you to the 9th European Congress of Qualitative Inquiry 2026 on behalf of the School of Philosophy. I feel deep pride that our academic family includes the Department of Psychology. With its high level of research and its contribution to society, it constitutes a strong pillar of our school. Its presence within the School of Philosophy highlights the necessary links between the humanities and the social sciences. This connection gives depth and scientific power to your work. I'm truly delighted to notice such an impressive participation in this significant scientific congress. The massive response from the international academic community proves its innovative character. It confirms that your field is at the center of modern research and that the dialogue you are about to begin is more necessary than ever. I'm also proud of the collaboration that made this event possible. The partnership between the Laboratory of Qualitative Research in Psychology and Psychosocial Wellbeing, the Institute of Qualitative Research, Applications in Social Sciences, Humanities and Education, and the European Network of Qualitative Inquiry guarantees the scientific quality of this Congress. The topic of your Congress, focusing on global flows, relational connections, and collaborative practices, is exceptionally relevant today. We are entering a new age of the human history. Every aspect of our personal and collective lives is subject to constant change. In these challenging times, society demands more than just data. It demands meaning. We need to be actively engaged with the history and the future we shape. Qualitative inquiry plays a crucial role in this context. Your conference program shows the richness and variety of contemporary qualitative research. Over these 4 days, you will explore questions that matter deeply to human experience and understanding, from history, culture, education, philosophy, to health and social justice, from new technology and digital life to arts-based methods and political practices. Your discussion will cover a full range of academic research in your field. I'm confident that your days here will be full of inspiration. I hope that your work will create new connections and offer new pathways for a better world. I wish you a productive dialogue and a pleasant stay in the city of Athens. Congratulations to the organizers and to all participants. Thank you.
Address by the Chair of the Department of Psychology of the School of Philosophy of the University of Athens, Professor Spiridon Tantaros.
Dear Vice Rector of Academic Affairs and International Relations of the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, dear Dean of the School of Philosophy of our university, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Department of Psychology of the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, it is a real pleasure for me to welcome you to the 9th European Congress of Qualitative Inquiry. Our department has long been committed to supporting scholarly initiatives such as this conference, initiatives that foster critical dialogue, methodological pluralism, and international collaboration. And we are especially pleased to host an event that brings together diverse perspectives and traditions of inquiry. Your presence here reflects a shared recognition that the questions we face today about human experience, responsibility, and coexistence cannot be approached in isolation. They call for attentiveness, humility, and cooperation across boundaries that are too often taken for granted. In a scientific landscape increasingly shaped by metrics, models, and large-scale data, it is important to reaffirm the distinct and indispensable contribution of qualitative approaches. While quantitative paradigms offer powerful tools for identifying patterns and general trends, they cannot on their own capture meaning, ambiguity, emotion, or the situated nature of human life. Qualitative methods remind us that people are not variables alone, but embodied relational beings whose experiences unfold within social, cultural, and historical contexts that psychology as a discipline has a responsibility to engage with critically and ethically. By engaging closely with lived experience, qualitative inquiry allows us to ask different kinds of questions. Questions about how realities are perceived, negotiated, resisted, and transformed. It encourages reflexivity and ethical sensitivity, and it helps ensure that voices at the margins are not lost in the pursuit of abstraction. In this sense, qualitative work does not compete with quantitative research, but complements and deepens it, expanding what counts as knowledge and whose knowledge matters. This commitment to epistemological openness has been central to the mission of our department, both in education and research, as we seek to promote psychology as a socially responsive and internationally engaged science. This relational understanding was powerfully articulated by William James. We all know William James, who wrote, I quote, "The community stagnates without the impulse of the individual. The impulse dies away without the sympathy of the community." Reference The Principles of Psychology, 1890. This insight speaks directly to the spirit of this conference and to the kind of scholarships we are called to practice. Work that honors both individual experience and collective life, and that connects local realities with broader global conversations. As psychologists, we are especially attuned to complexity, contradiction, and context. In the current era, our work must carefully respond to uncertainty, whether in the experiences of those affected by war, displacement, and migration, where narratives of loss, identity, and belonging defy simplistic categorization, in the profound psychological implications of environmental crises, where anxiety, grief, and responsibility are inseparable from place and future imaginaries, or in rapidly evolving digital landscapes which transform how individuals perceive themselves and relate to others. These challenges call upon us, both as scholars and as institutional actors, to ensure that our research and practice remain accountable to the communities and individuals whose lives they touch, and to cultivate approaches that create spaces for dialogue, reflection, and the emergence of new possibilities rather than imposing premature closure. This conference offers an opportunity not only to exchange ideas, but to cultivate relationships between scholars and communities, between research and practice, and between diverse ways of understanding the world. In supporting and hosting events like the 9th European Congress of Qualitative Inquiry, the Department of Psychology of our university seeks to actively promote psychology's engagement in international scientific dialogues and to support its continued advancement in Greece. These days invite us to question assumptions, to be surprised by unfamiliar perspectives, hopefully, and to allow dialogue to reshape our own thinking. May these conversations extend beyond the conference itself and continue to inform our shared work long after we leave. Before closing, I would like to express my sincere thanks to the chair of the conference, Professor Filia Isari, here present, as well as to the organizing committee and the scientific committee for their dedication, intellectual vision, and tireless work in bringing this event to fruition. Their efforts have made this gathering possible and have ensured the high quality of the program we are about to share. I wish you a rich and rewarding conference, and I thank you for being a part of it. Thank you.
Address by Professor of Counseling Psychology, Director of the Laboratory of Qualitative Research, and Chair of the Congress, Mrs. Filia Isari.
Dear Vice Rector for Academic Affairs, International Relations and Extroversion, Professor Sofia Papaioannou, dear Dean of the School of Philosophy, Professor Dimitrios Drousos, dear Chair of the Department of Psychology, Professor Speridon Tantaros, dear colleagues, dear students, and dear audience. It is a great joy to see you all here today. On behalf of the organizing committees, both the local and the steering committee of the European Network of Qualitative Inquiry, I welcome you at the 9th Congress of Qualitative Inquiry in the city of Athens. The inaugural edition of this EQI was in 2017 in Belgium, and since then it has been traveling across Europe, hosted by different universities, such as the University of Leuven, the University of Edinburgh, University of Malta, University of Portsmouth, UK, University of Helsinki, and next year, in its 10th university, we will travel to Seville, Spain. It is worth mentioning that this Congress is also a sister event of the International Congress of Qualitative Inquiry, ICQI, established in the United States since the year 2005. This year, some of us are meeting together again, others for the first time. People from many parts of the world, from 6 continents, Europe, Africa, North America, South America, Asia, and Australia, and from 35 countries. We are around 400 researchers from different disciplines, utilizing different ontologies, epistemologies, traditions, methodologies, and methods, innovations and advancements, qualitative, post-qualitative, inquirers, humanist, post-humanist, new materialist, post-foundationalist approaches, feminist, anti-ableist, community-based, engaged research, multimodal, arts-based, narrative, embodied, performative, dialogic, relational, collaborative, more than human relating, past, present, future encounters, and. Everything flows. Τα πάντα ρει. 2,500 years ago, Heraclitus' words aptly characterized today's global flows and accelerated pace of change. We're entering a new age of human history, one in which critical global challenges that transcend national boundaries, cultures, and languages are unprecedented, and radical changes are taking place. The qualitative inquiry community cannot just but be present. We need to be actively and collaboratively engaged with history and with the futures we all shape. This needs to account for the demands of global and local crises across many communities around the world. Let us harness the strengths, resiliences, synergies, creativities, transformative practices, hopes and possibilities that can grow in the light of our interconnectedness, our shared vulnerability, and our interdependency with human and other worlds, working towards realizing generative outcomes and transformational change in the hope of a better world. Thank you. And now it is a joy and honor to introduce our first keynote speaker, Professor Renos Papadopoulos. Allow me to say a few words about Professor Papadopoulos, founder, director of the Center for Trauma, Asylum, and Refugees of the MA and PhD programs in refugee care at the University of Essex, member of the Human Rights Center of the Transitional Justice Network and of the Armed Conflict and Crisis Hub, all of them at the University of Essex, as well as honorary clinical psychologist at the Tavistock Clinic. Professor Papadopoulos is a practitioner, trainer, and supervisor clinical psychologist, Jungian psychoanalyst, and systemic family psychotherapist. As a consultant to the United Nations and other organizations, he has been working with refugees, tortured persons, trafficked people, and other survivors of political violence and disasters in many countries. He lectures and offers specialist trainings internationally, and his writings have appeared in 18 languages. He has received Lifetime Achievement Awards by the European Family Therapy Association and by the International Association of Jungian Studies, by the University of Essex for the Best International Research Impact, and by 2 Mexican foundations for exceptional work and vulnerable children and families in Mexico. His last 2 books are on moral injury and involuntary dislocation. The latter has been hailed as inaugurating a new paradigm in the field. Professor Papadopoulos, καλώς ήρθατε στο Πανεπιστήμιο Αθηνών. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you for your very kind invitation. It's a great privilege to be with you today. Really very humbled and full of joy for being with you today. What I will try to share with you are some thoughts about a subject matter that is of relevance to all of us and to many, many disciplines. And it's extremely topical right now. So without any further ado, as they say, let me start. Yes. I've been seriously inspired by the remit, by the aims, by the aspirations of this conference to put itself in the context of the demands of global crisis and in the challenging times that we live now, and with the need to actively and collaboratively be engaged with history and with the futures that we shape. We shape history, and we are shaped by history. And this Congress does indeed include a lot of different disciplines, and therefore it fosters these, what I like the expression, polyphonic dialogues. And the aims are not really small, are quite high, to realize generative outcomes and transformative change, transformational change in the hope of a better world. So this is what I hope that my chosen subject matter will, in a very, very small and humble way, try to address in this context. It is the theme of trauma. And the theme of trauma, as we know nowadays, is no longer just only the domain of psychology or psychiatry. It is truly multi, and transdisciplinary phenomenon, and indeed includes a lot of different dimensions, starting from, sociological, philosophical, spiritual, political, economic, educational, climatic, environmental, literary, narrative. It includes all of these dimensions. So I'm starting with three main observations and three what I would call axiomatic arguments. I start with the observation that in our society today, we have somehow lost the ability to account, to sense, to validate human suffering. We often hear that people need a psychiatric label to validate their experience. Why? Because somehow through other interactions, human interactions in our society, they do not get that kind of sense of validation. They expect some kind of an external label to give them that validation. So what comes out of that? That in a sense, trauma has emerged as a most suitable, I would call it trope. Yes, trope. It's a trope that encompasses virtually all forms and perspectives of human suffering. By talking about trauma, it seems it covers everything. And trauma, in effect, it has become one of the most powerful transactional commodities. Yes, I would argue that it's very useful to understand trauma today as a commodity. And trauma, therefore, the trauma as a commodity has emerged, really, if you can really think about it, and we'll discuss that a little bit later, as a most thriving enterprise. It's bizarre to talk about it in this context, but think about it. It is. And the final observation is that the way we understand trauma is really formed imperceptibly. I'm not going to call it unconsciously, I'm going to call it imperceptibly or non-consciously, by what I would call societal discourses, basically narratives about trauma, that decisively affect the way we all understand and deal with trauma. So my argument is that the concept and process of curating. Curating is an appropriate one to use in order to grasp ways that such trauma societal discourses predominate and inform most trauma-related activities, from everyday talk, research, theorizing, therapy, etc. So let us start with trauma as a trope. Trope is a recurring theme, a plot, a device, a cliché that is easily recognizable and predictable. And when we talk about trauma, immediately we can get all of these. It oversimplifies complexity. Remember, we have heard about the need for complexity. Without complexity, we lose the reality of human beings. Human beings are not just oversimplified formulae. But somehow trauma gives us that illusion that when we talk about trauma, we capture something. Tropes refer to narrative, to plots, to characters, and of course, a trauma narrative is very familiar, and with the plot, it's also predictable, and characters that it creates. And I would also argue that trauma fulfills a kind of synecdochic function. Synecdoche in Greek, of course, is when one part expresses wider complexities. I would argue that trauma is a commodity, and the Oxford English Dictionary defines it as anything, commodity, as anything that can be traded, bought or sold, that can have a use value and an exchange value. But also, we can talk about information, feelings, culture, label, relationships, expertise. Can be used as force of commodity. It comes from the Latin commodus, which refers to something suitable, useful, opportune. And indeed, trauma is something suitable, useful, and opportune. Commodus comes etymologically from com, together, and modus, which is convenient, expedient, accessible. So a commodity also accommodates. The word accommodate, the verb accommodate comes from that. And somehow, by using the word trauma, it accommodates a lot of our anxieties and a lot of our complexities and a lot of the ambiguities, and it gives us this kind of illusion that somehow we're containing what we're talking about. Commodification is the noun that refers to the action and process of treating persons or things as property which can be traded, and the treatment of a person or a thing as a commodity, commercialization. At first, the word commodification was used in 1974 in relation to modern art, but it can be used also in the context of other phenomena. For example, we're talking about the sexual commodification of women. The idea of curating comes, of course, initially and predominantly from museum exhibitions. But as Lindsay Pearson developed as a research methodology, curating refers to the action verbs of collecting, organizing, researching, conceptualizing, selecting, contextualizing, arranging, and interpreting. In other words, what is the curating that is happening that we perceive certain phenomena in the context of trauma? What are the societal narratives that are curated and presented in that way? So, talking about trauma, we have so many definitions. Do we have any clear understanding what trauma is? There are so many different uses of the word trauma, and I haven't found anywhere any systematic way of putting them all together and grouping them in some way that we can understand what we're talking about. So I have ventured this classification of the different groups of the word, of how we use the word trauma. First, of course, it's in the colloquial language, which basically refers to any form of discomfort. People are waiting for 10 minutes longer at bus stations, they're traumatized. I've read that. I did not invent it. I've read it in newspapers. Because their football team has been lost, they have been traumatized. The word trauma is a kind of a, in English we would say, a posh word for some kind of suffering. And everybody's using it. But of course we will say that, yes? Mm-hmm. Why is it not? Yeah, okay. We will say that, of course, it's a psychoanalytic concept. Yes, which psychoanalysis? Jungian, Lacanian, Freudian, and which Freud? The early Freud, the middle Freud, the late Freud. So if we thought that we can find exactly what it means by trauma in psychoanalysis, we're not going to get very far. We'll get a lot of interesting definitions, but we will not really understand exactly what trauma is. We will say, okay, in psychiatry we have a clear understanding of what trauma is, especially when we're talking about post-traumatic stress disorder. But of course, again, which one are we talking about? The DSM-3 or DSM-4 or DSM-5 definition? In other words, there are so many different definitions there. No, now we nailed it. With neuropsychology, we know exactly what trauma is. We can see it in the brain. But wait a minute, if we heard a huge explosion now, a big bang now, and some people thought that it was, God forbid, a terrorist attack, it would register fear. But if some people thought that their team won the FA Cup or whatever, football cup or whatever, it will register joy. So in what way is it then neuropsychology pinning down exactly the trauma? I'm not really sure. It precedes an interpretation. If we're talking about human social sciences and arts, of course, in every situation there, for example, in history or literary studies, or sociology, gender studies, cultural studies, theater and film studies, there is no accepted understanding of trauma. Everybody ventures their own definition of what trauma is. When we're talking about the impact from exposure to various forms of adversities, like, I don't know, wars or natural disasters, there is a huge range of impacts from PTSD, from post-traumatic stress disorder, to disorientation and suffering. Often we say that actually these are normal responses to abnormal circumstances. Then, of course, we have a lot of specific trauma situations like, I don't know, disaster trauma, divorce trauma, war trauma, employment trauma, financial trauma, retirement trauma, bullying trauma, Brexit trauma, failure trauma, all sorts of traumas. And of course, each one is different from the other. So that will not really tell us what trauma is. And then, of course, we have the collective traumas, such as national and cultural traumas, societal traumas, community traumas, post-colonial traumas. That doesn't mean that everybody in that particular society suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder. But in medicine, it's where the word trauma exists, in the accident and emergency, and that is what traumatology is. When we bring it into the social and human sciences, it's a metaphorical meaning. So I would argue that, yes, we use so frequently the word trauma, but we do not really have a clear understanding of what trauma is. But we all are exposed to images of this nature all the time. And this is what we call trauma. This is what we call traumatizing images. And these images are real, of real suffering in the world. So let us try to go right from the beginning. What is the nature of these events, and what is the impact of these events? Let's start from that end. I would argue that the nature of these events is, I like pictures, I like pictorial understanding, and it is like a big dark cloud that descends on us, and it's full of different components, such as, the enormity of the phenomena, of the complexity, violence, abhorrence, destructiveness, injustices, inhumanity, human rights violations, pain, losses, suffering, and cruelty. All of it is just too much. All of that is just too much. And the impact they have is overwhelming. It's overwhelming. It floods us. It semi-paralyzes us. And the impact is not only on those people who suffer trauma, but it is on everybody, on the whole society, on us who try to understand what these situations are about, and us to try to tease out what their effects are and everything. So I would really argue that these three key components, which I call kind of lethal clusters, that often in these situations we're exposed to concrete destructiveness. We see people suffering, we see destructions of buildings, or people are raped, or whatever, there is something concrete. Destructiveness is concrete. All of these phenomena are highly emotionally charged. And also there is an urgent need. We need to do something. So I would argue that this cluster of these three components has an overwhelming impact on all of us. And what is the result of that? We are getting almost semi-paralyzed by that. But nevertheless, as human beings, we have an overwhelming, an unrelenting need to understand, and we tend to develop an understanding that inevitably is likely to be of a simplified, lacking complexity, and the most common form of a simplification is polarization, black and white. Black and white. We're the good ones, they're the bad ones. As stark as that. And then we talk about in the field they are traumatized or they're resilient. There isn't such a thing. People are traumatized in the context of certain situations and resilient in other situations. I've never seen in my life a totally traumatized or a totally resilient human being. But we use these terms all the time. The field itself is named in two opposite ways. Some people call the field strengths-based, and others call it trauma-informed. Why? People who are trauma-informed, are they not aware of the strengths of people, and vice versa? Why this polarization with these names? That's a testimony, that's a proof of what I'm saying, that we tend to become polarized and resort to oversimplified ways of understanding things as a result of these situations, of being overwhelmed. And then ultimately, as therapists or as humanitarians or as researchers, we feel either impotent, we cannot do anything, or totally omnipotent, we can do everything. So what are the main, therefore, consequences of being exposed to what I call severe forms of collective adversity is really the loss of complexity. we tend to lose complexity. And repeating the three lethal components, concrete destructiveness, highly emotionally charged experiences, and urgent pressing needs. This somehow paralyzes us, overwhelms us. And this overwhelming impact has an effect in diminishing our capacity to process and digest, to assimilate events and experiences. And in psychology, we have this nice expression, we have no space to think, no space to think. And we resort to impulsive thinking, or what I call epistemological acting out. In other words, we concoct some kind of understanding that has some kind of elements of reality, but actually it is an oversimplification. And with the oversimplification or polarization, in effect, when we try to conceptualize this phenomena, we distort reality. And if we distort reality, how can we effectively plan and intervene properly in this situation? So just let's even try to understand even the way we try to define trauma. There is a fundamental confusion between the events and circumstances that cause the trauma, and the trauma is the effect of what happens in people when they're traumatized. So much so, I mean, often people say, tell me about your trauma. I mean, tell me about the events that we assume that have traumatized you. We confuse the events from the outcomes. And in effect, we have a circular definition. And we basically define that traumatic events are those that cause trauma, and trauma is that is caused by traumatic events, which is totally nonsense. I mean, in this university, in any university, a first-year student of logic or philosophy will tell you that such tautological definitions are nonsensical. And yet, just let's be real, look at the literature. Our definition of trauma is based on these tautological definitions. So the question is, confusing trauma, the event, from trauma, the outcome. So why such shocking and glaring unclarity is tolerated and not even noticed? Because when we are exposed to these situations, we tend to lose our capacity for complexity. This is the proof. Another example is this. Logically, we understand that there is a kind of a cause and effect. If you are exposed to adversity, if the events, you will have some effects which are reactions, symptoms, and consequences. That's fine, makes perfect sense. If you are exposed to war, you are likely to be traumatized. That's fine. But wait a minute, I thought that psychology, and not just only psychology, but any thinking person, would consider a whole lot of other things that mediate between the events and the way we experience the events. It's not just the events themselves, it's how we experience them. What are the motives? What are the contexts? What are the prospects? What are the meaning attribution processes? And here, all of us are fully aware of what is in that green box, in mediating, in the factors that affect the way that we experience adversity. All psychology and all human beings can understand this. There are personal factors, history, psychological characteristics, coping mechanisms, strengths, weaknesses, so many factors. Then there are relational factors, supporting systems, etc. Then gender, age, race, ethnicity, disability, there are so many studies about what affects people's experience of events. sweetly forget about all of these things. Oh, you have been exposed to war? Surely you have been traumatized. There is some epistemological trickstery there. Power positions. How much research there is about power positions, degrees of isolation, helplessness, humiliation, circumstances of actual devastating events, predictability, isolation, duration, lasting effects, meaning systems. What meaning systems people have, consciously or non-consciously. I've worked in 49 countries. I work with people who say to me, it was Allah's will that this happened to me. Allah is punishing me, Allah is testing me, or whatever, whatever. They have meaning systems that they understand their experiences. Then we're not talking only about the past, but also hope or lack of hope for the future, current conditions, future prospects, plus a whole host of socio-political, cultural, economic, legal factors, all of these societal discourses of trauma, all of these are in the green box. What is mediated between the external event and the way we experience the event. Sweetly, we forget about all of that. And we say, because you have been exposed to that, therefore you have been traumatized. That's, I don't know what to call it. You find a word for that. But what I'm saying, it lacks complexity, just mildly. If we go back actually to the very definition of the word trauma, of course, it comes from the Greek word trauma, and the origin is from the verb titrosko, which means to pierce, but actually people stop there. But I've done a little bit of, it's really shocking with so much research and so much money into trauma, and nobody bothered to try to understand a little bit more about that origin. And in my amateurish classics, I tried to do some research, and I found that what is connected with titrosko is the verb tiro, which means to rub. And again, in the ancient Greek meaning of the word to rub, there are two meanings: to rub in and to rub off. To rub in is if you rub something in, inevitably you are going to create a trauma, a wound, or an injury. But what is rubbing off? Rubbing off is when you take, in English we say something like, it's a rubber, a razor. You write something and that's rubbing off. So trauma has that rubbing off effect. The powerful experience rubs off previous ways of people understanding themselves, understanding relationships, understanding their life, understanding their meaning of life. And we forget about that. We are always going back into the rubbing in and the damage and the wound meaning of the word trauma. But the word trauma, according to even its original ancient Greek meaning, refers to also the burnishing, this rubbing off, this creating tabula rasa. This is not an etymological gymnastics. Anybody who has worked with people who have been seriously traumatized, they have been saying to me, doctor, because I lost everything, because I saw half of my life being killed, now I'm wondering, shall I continue doing what I used to do before, or what shall I do anymore? And you see people transformed as a result of that. They say to me, I want to go back and finish my degree. I don't want to, I will stop taking drugs. I will try to make more meaningful use of my life, etc., etc. That is not the titrosko meaning of trauma, but it is the tiro meaning of trauma, which is the creating new perspectives, rubbing off, erasing previous ways of understanding myself and my life. And this is what this is what I would like us not to forget. This is what creates the complexity of the trauma that we should try to reintroduce instead of the cliches. And this is what, putting all of that together, has let me develop the adversity grid. We will have a workshop on Friday on that, that has been used by many international organizations now in many different contexts, that helps us to grasp the complexity as much as we can. Let me explain this grid. There are 3 columns: the negative effects to adversity, the unchanged, and the positive ones. And that refers to not only the individuals, but we can address families or communities or wider societies. Even when we're looking at the negative effects, we should not forget that the negative effects are not all negative in the same severity, with the same severity. Not every trauma is PTSD. Please, let's not forget. PTSD is D. D refers to disorder. Disorder refers to psychiatric disorder, which refers to severe forms of dysfunctionality. We've very glibly been using the word PTSD immediately after some event, saying that people have some flashbacks, they suffer from PTSD. Of course, it's not as simple as that. I don't know how many of us who very liberally use the word PTSD have actually seen the criteria of the nosology of DSM or ICD, I mean, any kind of classification system of the different components of PTSD. So PTSD, I would say, not only PTSD, but any other form of psychiatric disorder belongs to the most severe forms of negative effects of being exposed to adversity. There are moderate forms, which would be clusters of different psychological symptoms that do not add up to a psychiatric disorder. I hope you understand what I mean by that. You can feel, I don't know, have an inability to concentrate, or you have some flashbacks, but you don't have all the other ones that constitute the whole cluster of PTSD. So this would be a moderate version, not a severe form of negative effects of being exposed to adversity as the psychiatric disorder. But also there is a more milder form of negative effects of being exposed to adversity. All of us feel sadness when our grandmother of 98 dies. You know, you can still feel some sadness and some anguish, but you cannot call that PTSD. So we need to differentiate. How do we counteract the lack of complexity? By reintroducing complexity. And that means differentiate. So we need to differentiate the negative effects in terms of their different degrees of severity. And then, however badly people have been exposed to adversity, and however badly they have developed negative effects, always, they retain some strengths from their previous lives, before they were exposed to adversity. Always. So the question is, do we notice that? Do we take that into account? Do they notice it? Is that part of the picture that we have of the people in front of us? Or are we just seduced by some negative effects and we just don't see people with their complexity, uniqueness, and totality in front of us, which we should if we really want to help. And of course, all of us love the word holistic. All of us want to work holistically, but how can we work holistically if we are just zooming only on the negative effects and ignore all the other effects? And not ignoring all the other effects means introducing complexity, and it means being aware of what unchanged positive features exist in that particular person. And of course, let's not forget that there are also positive effects of being exposed to adversity. And this requires a lot of epistemological agility and sensitivity, because we can say, I don't know, the pandemic is very bad, but because of the pandemic, a lot of acts of kindness have been developed, or a lot of other things have been developed. I live in a particular part of London in the UK for 45 years, and we have a good community there. Because of the pandemic, we developed a WhatsApp group to help people with their shopping and this and that. And that WhatsApp group, which did not exist before the pandemic, it was developed because of the pandemic, now has improved the quality of our neighborhood. So the pandemic is bad, but the WhatsApp group and the cohesion of our community is positive. So we need to find ways to not to be seduced and say everything is negative and negative and negative. That's lack of complexity, or what I was saying earlier. And this is trying to find what are the positive effects as well. Let's not forget, in all cultures and in all languages, there are expressions of whatever doesn't kill you strengthens you. And that's a reality. That's why it is there. So what are the various forms of adversity-activated development? That's exactly what I was saying earlier about the people saying, because I lost so much, now I'm viewing myself in a different way. And we will look at that now. So the resilient feature, let's not go into that. If there is any discussion, we can discuss that. In the same way that the word trauma, it's a word for all seasons and means everything and nothing. The same is about resilience. The definitions of resilience vary from lofty aspirations to some idealistic states to all sorts of different things. I have a very clear and operational definition of resilience, which comes from physics, from the original meaning, which refers to the ability of a body to continue displaying the same functioning after being exposed to some adversity. So here, the resilient features in this context refers to the existing strengths, resources, positive qualities, characteristics, behaviors, functioning, relationships that were retained from before people exposed to adversity and survived despite their exposure to adversity, whereas adversity-activated development refers to the new strengths that did not exist before, positive qualities, characteristics, etc., that they were activated specifically and acquired because people were exposed to that particular adversity. Like a person stopped taking drugs, trying to do better use of his life, etc., etc. And Jung, not that we need somebody to tell us, but I like what Jung keeps telling us, that suffering is not an illness. Suffering is not an illness. I'll come back to that again. But it's the normal counterpole of happiness. I want to illustrate this, not with clinical material, which is difficult in gatherings of this nature, but there is a book that has been written by Martine Wright in Britain. She was on the Tube London Underground Metro one day when she, I think it was 2005, when there was the bombing in King's Cross, and basically she lost both legs, but it took her longer than anybody else to survive. It took her a couple of years to survive. She was going to die all the time, etc. So Martine Wright writes beautifully, and let's follow what she's saying. This is in the public domain. In some ways, it was the best thing that ever happened to me. The best thing that happened to her? That she was in that accident? That took her 2 years to survive? And she lost her legs? Just let's follow what she says. No, I can't say the best thing. It's not quite right. It was the most life-changing, correctly. It's lovely because she's sort of like speaking to us, and that's why I've chosen this. It's the most life-changing thing that has had profound and positive effect on me. It may sound absolutely mad to say. She's aware of that, but it's very unusual to say that it was a very useful thing for her. But look at this house. Oscar, my son, Nick, my husband, my whole family being able to stand in the sun, listening to the birds. What she's telling us is that her capacity to look at the sun and value it was substantially increased after that accident. She's telling us that before she was not aware of the sun. She was not aware of the birds singing. Now she's aware of that. And she's valuing that. That is the tiro. That is the rubbing off. That is the renewal that happens from being exposed to that adversity. And this is what the usual way that we talk about trauma does not encapsulate. And she carries on. Part of me says, yeah, the key thing here is not, say, people ask me if I would turn the clock back. You understand what that means? Surely you would have liked not to have gone through all of that ordeal. And she says, actually, no. Part of me said, yeah, it would be nice to have my legs back, but my life now is so amazing. In other words, she's saying, look at this. Her book is called Unbroken. Her body is broken, but she's saying her spirit is unbroken. Now, you may say she's a unique person. She's not. I assure you that with every person that I've worked with, in so many countries over the years, I have seen that adversity-activated development because I have some framework that can account for that. But if our framework is only about the negative in an undifferentiated way, without complexity, we're not going to see that. And what we lose also is the differentiation between distress and disorder. Whatever is distressful, we call it disorder and we call it trauma. Distress refers to expected and normal, healthy reactions to abnormal circumstances. It's when our suffering is digested. Disorder refers to abnormal responses to abnormal circumstances beyond the expected time, context, and impact. Undigested suffering. This reminds me of the image of the elephant with blind men. This man who is holding the elephant's tail is saying, this is tangible, this is a snake. He's blind, yeah, he's holding the tail and he's saying, this is a snake. When people are talking about trauma and there is suffering, yes, there is suffering. What else is there? What else is there? Do we have the adversity grid to understand and appreciate the whole range of effects of being exposed to adversity? Or in an oversimplified, without any complexity perspective, we understand trauma exclusively in terms of its negative effects. Negative effects are part of that. I'm not idealizing suffering. I'm not idealizing trauma. There is a lot of suffering. But in addition to that, there is also some resilience and some new strengths, which is comes from the adversity-activated development. When we're looking, for example, on images of this nature, we see the destruction, we see the devastation, we see suffering, we see the trauma, but we also see the amazing resilience of people that even under these conditions, It's important for them to retain their human dignity and wear clean clothes, and they will do their washing, and they will put their washing up. So what is it that we see when we see a situation, when we see a human being in front of us? Do we see only the trauma, or do we have a complex framework that will allow us to see both the trauma, not to forget the trauma, not to forget the suffering, but also see the resilience and the adversity-activated development? This is not just an abstract theorization. It has direct effect in terms of the way that people are developing identities as a result of that. Yes, indeed, if somebody has been exposed to adversity, we can say, colloquially, that they are victims of that adversity. So a victim of adversity is the inevitable outcome of being exposed to adverse and devastating events and circumstances, but that inevitably leads to people developing a victim identity. And we need to have another important make another epistemological distinction between people being victims of adversity, which is an inevitable effect, from developing a victim identity. As we know, developing a victim identity develops passivity, lack of responsibility, inappropriate dependence, and entitlement. It disempowers people. In psychology, we have this amazingly beautiful expression, horrible indeed, about the phenomenon, learned helplessness. They learn to become helpless. We need to, with some humility, really realize that often we teach them to become helpless. We teach them to become helpless. And I would argue a perspective on trauma in the majority of situations that we use it does develop learned helplessness in people. People the vulnerability is rewarded, etc., etc. So the secondary victimization, no, I'm not talking about burnout. I'm talking about us as helpers or researchers, the way that we inadvertently install and strengthen victim identity in the people. We tend to pathologize those people that we want to help. We want to call them this and that so that we can help them. We cannot accept that actually they have a whole range of responses. I would say that actually adversity survivors are really like philosophers. Exposed to severe forms of adversity, people are shaken to the core of their beings. Every aspect of their being is shaken. People, according to the saying, either lose God or find God in these situations. Their epistemological positions are revisited, are refreshed. There is that possibility. And there is a unique opportunity for a restructuring of the personality, a restructuring of their life priorities, of their own identities, and their own understanding of their meaning of life. So they ask directly or indirectly, and in a clumsy way mostly, not in a philosophical way that we would expect as academics or researchers, but they are asking something like, why me? What is the nature of life and death, of good and evil, of human nature, purpose of life? They do ask that directly or indirectly. Do we listen to that, or we just simply see them as traumatized people? And of course, we have wonderful techniques that we learn for 3 weekends, and we have certificates on the wall, and we have a bag of tricks, and we go there and we will help them with their trauma. That's what we usually do. Do we understand the complexity? Do we take the challenge of helping them to develop further this rejuvenation from the rubbing off possibility of trauma? People say all the time, variations, these are from a person, all of a sudden I became a grown-up. I mean, they are aware of their transformation. Are we aware of their transformation, or we're there only to get rid of their pain? In other words, treating them as some machine with some imperfection. There is a radical readjustment of one's understanding of oneself and around them. So in a sense, I would argue that and I'm getting to the end slowly, don't worry. There are two approaches or two languages when we're dealing with severe forms of adversity, collective adversity or even individual adversity. One is the language of damage and repair, which is easily comprehensible. Usually we see it as the language of medicine. If you break your arm, you will go there, they will repair it, they will fix it, that's fine. It fits with organizational structures of care, but victimhood is rewarded. And this is basically like any kind of, car mechanic or computer engineer that you take your computer to fix it because we're talking about some malfunctions there, and we treat people like that. But also there is something, I don't know what to call it, there is no language for that. Language was existential disruptive upheavals where there are the transformational possibilities. So these are to remind you of the adversity grid that helps us as a framework. People are using it in all sorts of different ways. They can use it also as a technique or as a research tool. We have been using it and we'll present some of our research in different parts of the world on Friday. But I want to go back. I'm aware where we are. On Aristotle, when he's talking about well-being, all of us are talking about well-being, well-being, well-being. But Aristotle made a very, very pertinent distinction between two types of well-beings. One is what he called hedonic, which hedonism, etc., okay, which is avoidance of suffering, pursuing happiness and pleasure. And I would argue that the overwhelming majority of trauma discourses are pursuing an understanding of well-being in a hedonic way. Stop any suffering. Any suffering is an illness. Stop it, that is trauma. But Aristotle was talking about a eudaimonic perspective, type of well-being, which is about actualizing one's potential, living according to one's unique nature, acquiring a sense of fulfillment, exactly what Martin Wright was telling us about. Let's not forget that. I would argue that perhaps a hedonic understanding of well-being is fairly barbaric, but that's what is predominant today in the trauma discourses that we have. That's what I wanted to say. Going back to our conference, which I very much look forward to, and I congratulate the organizers for organizing such a magnificent event, we have an opportunity to revisit all of these issues from a different perspective, is to realize generative outcomes and transformational change. What I've been talking about in a very humble way, in a very modest way, a small way of understanding some transformational change in the hope of a better world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Papadopoulos, for giving us new languages, new ways of thinking about trauma through epistemological agility. I don't know if there are any questions. Would you like to comments? We welcome them. Remarks? Thank you.
I'm sure that everybody wants to go for the reception, but if anybody wants to ask anything. In any case, I will be here for the whole week, so you can ask me if you want anything else later. But
Okay.
Here I am, if there is anybody to...
Okay. So we can proceed with the musical interlude. A string quartet of the Department of Music Studies of the School of Philosophy. Thank you. Thank you very much. And now we will all go for a small reception at Kostis Palamas, a building nearby. Those of you who do not know, they can follow the rest of us. Thank you. See you soon. Bye-bye.